Hello, everybody. My name is Hunter Marion. I'm the new small grants manager for CHEJ. Welcome, everybody, to this training call on environmental testing. This has been one of the largest calls of people registering, so I'm really excited for that. Today, we will be hosting the call will be Stephen Lester. He's our science director. For those not familiar with CHEJ, we provide three main services. Our main services are strategizing and organizing, communications, and technical assistance when it comes to science. So when it comes to the technical assistance science half of CHEJ, Stephen is the go-to person. He's a toxicologist, and I'll give the floor to him to let him speak for the rest.
Thank you, Hunter. Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon, and depending on where you are. I'm really happy to be here today and to share some experiences that I've had with environmental testing and to try to answer many of your questions. The way I want to run this today is that I'll talk for somewhere 20 minutes or maybe a few minutes more in that ballpark. And then I'd like to throw it open to Q&A. If you have questions as we go along, put them in the chat. Hunter will sort of monitor and facilitate the Q&A, and he'll go to the chat and go to your raised hands as we go through that period. Just when you do get to that, just please identify who you are and the group you're with, if you would. So we're here today to talk about environmental testing, and there's no question that this is one of the most fundamental issues that all of our groups deal with. I mean, and so, yeah, it's important. But what is environmental testing? I have some slides I put together to try to make this a little easier. Let me see if I can share my screen and we'll get going. Come on.
Yep, we can see it, Stephen.
Yep. Okay, so now I got to go back to the beginning, if I can do that. It's okay. So what is environmental testing? And it's very simple. I'm sure many of you have experienced this. It's just collecting samples after you've sent them to a laboratory to be analyzed, and whether it's air, water, or soil. It tells you the concentrations of the chemicals in the samples, which is essentially what's there. And it's the key starting point for understanding what the health risks are posed by the contamination. So in very simple terms, environmental testing tells you if there's any chemicals in your air or water or soil, depending on what you're concerned about. Is it important? Yes, I think we all recognize that it is. And why is it important? Because it essentially provides the evidence that contamination exists. It also helps define who's been exposed. It can tell you how far contamination has spread from a point source, whether you're looking at groundwater movement, air downwind from a facility in terms of air emissions, or just contamination in the soil. So, and that can also tell you who's been affected by it. But fundamentally, it provides the basis for evaluating health risks as a result of exposure. And in the case of a cleanup, if you don't know what the contamination is and how far it's spread, then you can't develop a cleanup plan. So that's really critical. So where do you begin? Well, it's really quite simple. You begin with why are you concerned? What made you think you need environmental testing in the first place? Is it because there was contamination in your water? Your water smells. Maybe it's the air that smells. Maybe it's the industrial facility downwind you're worried about. But usually, what drives you to the question is what is the basis for where you begin. One exercise we often run people through is to map your community. And I'm not going to go into this as we run a whole exercise around this, but fundamentally, when you map your community, you will begin by identifying where you are, where the people live, and then you begin to identify what the sources of contamination are. Where is that plant located? Is there a landfill on some part of the town? And you don't have to do your whole community. A lot of times it's just the neighborhood that you're concerned about. And you begin to also ask questions like, well, what direction is the groundwater flow? How are the rivers running? What's their direction? Where are you in relation to the wind, and where does the wind blow from that point source, from that industrial facility? Those are the kinds of questions. And there's a whole lot more. And I should have mentioned this when we started, but we actually have a guidebook called Environmental Testing. And it covers way more than what I can cover in the short 25 minutes today. But it has all kinds of details about environmental testing and much more, again, than we'll talk about today.
I
So
will actually put a link to that guidebook in the chat for everybody.
that would be great. That would be great. So there's also some key questions, and we have put together a bunch of questions. I'll show you a sample of this at the very end of my presentation. But there's a lot of important questions you need to ask that drives all of the issues around testing. And it begins with the first question I have here, or the last bullet, which is, why do you want to do environmental testing? What is driving you to do it? All right, so the first question you want to ask yourself is, what's the goal and purpose of the testing? Which goes back to, why do you want to do it? I mean, are you just curious? Do you want to know if there's contamination in your wells? Are you trying to convince the government that there's a problem they need to address? Is it a basis for legal action? But whatever you decide is your goals and the purpose, you also need to think through a plan for what to do with the results. This is very important. You should never gather any data or chase any data or try to get government to do any data without figuring out a plan for what you're going to do with the results once you get it. And before you can figure out that question, before you can figure out a plan for what to do with the results, you have to be clear on what your goals are as an organization. Because any testing you go after, any testing you get done or get the government to do for you, should be part of helping you get to achieve your goals as a group. So all of this environmental testing and the data that's generated by this testing should be part of your overall plan to achieve your goals. And how do you use this data to help achieve your goals? If you want cleanup, how does it help you get that? If you want relocation, how does it help you get that? If you want more data, how does it help you do that? So need to keep that in mind. It's a very important piece of all of this conversation. So what's the best medium to sample? Yes, there's air, there's soil, there's water. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's clear in a lot of situations. But fundamentally, the answer to this question is whatever going to give you the most reliable and useful information. Testing is expensive. So if you're going to do it yourself, if you're going to pay for it, you need to choose wisely. Groundwater, in very general terms, is the most reliable medium to sample, followed by soil and then air. Air is extremely not volatile, that's the wrong word to use, extremely unreliable, because it's like taking a picture. This is what's in the air at the moment of your sampling, or during that period of your sampling. And so it's highly variable. It's subject to wind. It's subject to temperature. Humidity can influence. There's a lot of things that influence an air test. So it's not great. I mean, sometimes it's what you need to do, and sometimes it's all you got, but it's highly variable. What do you look for? This is the most important question, but it's not an easy one to answer. What you look for depends on what you think is causing your problem. Where are the contaminants coming from? Is it a nearby landfill? Is it an industrial plant, contaminated site? And what are the contaminants at any of these sites? Sometimes you have a clear sense of that. Sometimes you don't. But it's one of the hardest questions. But to help you address that uncertainty and that reality there's a variety of different tests, standardized tests that you can look for, and any lab that you go to will know about these kind of tests and be able to talk you through some options that you would have and what it would cost. So typically what government tends to do, most state agencies, when they initially go to do some kind of pollution testing, environmental testing of some kind, they look for a group of contaminants generally referred to as general pollution parameters. That's a typo on the screen. It should say parameters. And these include things like biological oxygen demand, or BOD, chemical oxygen demand, or COD, turbidity, pH, specific conductance, total suspended solids, chloride, nitrogen, and so on. There's a handful of these, maybe 12 or 15. These mostly address bacteria and originally pollution from what they used to call sanitary landfills. Nothing sanitary about them, so we don't certainly use that term anymore. Never did, actually. The most common tests to run specifically for water are the substances referred to as priority pollutants. They used to be 128, actually. I should update this. I think it's down to 126 now because they took dioxin off it, and I think they took another substances off it. But still, it's a group of substances that include metals, volatile organic chemicals, semi-volatile organic chemicals, PAHs or polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons, PCBs, and a handful of pesticides. This is the primarily go-to test if you don't know what you're looking for when you want to address pollution from some kind of toxic or industrial site. And I'll go into some of the more details in terms of what to look for amongst each of these later. But fundamentally, this test runs around anywhere from $1,000 to $1,500. It's a pretty expensive test. But you can look for metals alone, you can look for VOCs alone, semi-volatiles, etc. You can look for very specific components of this group of tests. And if you want to test, for example, arsenic and lead, it's going to cost you as much to test for those two as it will to run a whole metals group. So it's always, if you think it's metals you want to test or start with, do the whole metal scan. Same with the volatile chemicals. There's 27 of them. If you wanted to just find out if you had benzene and trichloroethylene, you can do that. It'll be less, but in most cases, most labs charge you the same because they have to run, from their point of view, they have to run the same equipment for the same test, whether you pull out 2 chemicals or all 27. So from a cost point of view, if you do one, you do them all. Another option is to look just for specific drinking water standards. EPA has, I think, a total of 87 drinking water standards now. And these are unique in that they are the only legally enforceable standards that EPA operates by. That means that if any substance, let's say it's arsenic, exceeds the drinking water standards for arsenic in your water, anything that exceeds that, you cannot drink, you should not drink that water. And EPA, if they find out about it, would not allow you to drink that water. They would tell you cannot do that. And if there's a company responsible for that pollution, they would be the ones who have to clean it up. So it's an enforceable standard. There are no air standards that are enforceable in the same kind of way in terms of individual contamination in your home or on your property. There are air standards that are enforceable as a group, like, you can't exceed this much of pollution in a certain length of time. But in terms of a concentration that you would be breathing, there's no enforceable standard for a specific concentration like that. The same for soil standards. But anyway, another group that you can look for, and this is a common one that's useful when you don't know what to look for, is these chemicals or substances called screening compounds. First one is TOX, or total organic halogens. The next one is total organic carbon, total petroleum hydrocarbons, and BTEX, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene, and volatile organic compounds. These are common groups of substances that you can look for that when you're not sure what to look for, and you can use these groups to give you a sense of, well, we did the TOX test and we got 25 parts per million. That means there could be substantial amounts of individual chemicals. So then you could go back and look for more detailed volatiles. And the same with the total petroleum hydrocarbons, or even the BTEX ones. Those are mostly for gasoline, because those are the substances you typically find if you have an underground storage tank or a gasoline tank that leaks. So depending on what you look for, some of these can be useful. The VOCs is a very interesting one to use. But there are limitations in these. And let me give you a simple example. I'm doing some work now with the residents in East Palestine, where that had that horrific train wreck almost a year ago now. And EPA came in initially, and what they did after the train wreck, some of you, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with it, but they burned 5 tankerfuls of vinyl chloride. And of course, that generated dioxin and a bunch of other chemicals as byproducts of the combustion. But when EPA went in to do testing, all they did was VOCs. volatile organic compounds. And they told the media, oh, we're looking for vinyl chloride. And they told the public they're looking for vinyl chloride. Well, they weren't looking for vinyl chloride because while vinyl chloride would have been picked up by the VOC test in the air as one of 27 different VOCs in the air, they weren't specifically looking for vinyl chloride. And so if they got tests of vinyl of less than 50 parts per billion in the VOC test, they would have said everything's fine. But if 50% of that, if half of that was vinyl chloride, that would be substantial and that would be a problem. So the screening compounds have their limitations, and that's just a simple example to try to bring that home. But they can also get you started on what to look for. So who should do the testing? This depends on one thing primarily, and that is where can you get a reliable test that you can trust? That's the fundamental issue. Now, that's the ideal world, but there are 4 options for how you achieve that. You can do it yourself, gather a sample, send it to the lab. You can hire someone to do it, get the government to do it, or ask the responsible party. So now if you do it yourself, that's going to cost, that's the biggest advantage to doing that, obviously, is you have control. You can decide where to test, what to look for, and when you get the results, you'll get it quickly and you'll get the actual results in the lab and not some homogenized summary provided by the agencies, which is what happened. It's been going on in East Palestine. No raw data has been made available to the public from EPA. And if you send it to the lab, you need to figure out what lab to go to. Who do you choose? And there's a whole lot that could be said about that. I'm not going to go into that in a great deal of detail. There's a lot of discussion about that in our guidebook. But you want to go to a lab that has done work with the public, ideally. And some of the things you'd look for is the lab certified by EPA? That's probably the most important thing to look for, because if they are, then they're going to use standardized protocols in the analytical side and in the laboratory. There's certain procedures, standard procedures EPA has developed for analyzing metals, pesticides, VOCs, and so on. You want to make sure your lab is using those standardized methods. And if they do all of that, they'll apply to EPA and get certified, and that's sort of the gold standard for labs. But if the lab is constantly doing work for industry or the government, they're not going to want to do anything with you, and they're not likely. You don't want to do that any work with them either, because they won't be helpful to you if they're certainly if they're have done work in the past with a company that's the polluter in your situation. You should walk away. It's a conflict of interest. They wouldn't even probably take your tests. So, and there's a lot more I can say about that, but I'll just leave it at that for now. You can hire someone to do it for you. And of course, and the other thing about it, if you do it yourself, it's expensive, and hiring for you is even more expensive, because then somebody else is going to go out there. But what they'll do, and the other thing, if you do it yourself, that I forgot to mention, is that the first thing the government would say is, well, how do we know that you didn't spike the sample? You have a credibility issue. And so that's the biggest problem with doing it yourself. But you can hire someone to do it, which addresses that issue, and that's a good thing. But that makes it more expensive. But the lab, if you hire someone to do it for you, you can do a hybrid where you work with the lab and they send you a kit that would include the sample bottles, the instructions on how to collect the sample, how to store the sample in the interim during transport to get it to the lab. They can send you all of that and make it a lot easier and less expensive, because then all you're paying for is fundamentally the analytical work, the cost of actually analyzing the samples. So there is that hybrid. Getting the government can do it is a good thing sometimes, and sometimes it's your only option in terms of cost, but you lose control. And that means you don't know necessarily where they'll take it. You can tell them where you want them to take it, but they might not necessarily do it. You can tell them what you want to look for, but they'll do whatever they want in all likelihood. And then it might take months to get the results. And as I mentioned earlier, you might not get the actual results. You might get some summarized table, which makes it harder to interpret and understand. And asking the responsible party to do it, I know of only a handful of places that's ever worked. Most responsible parties won't even talk to you. So interpreting the results. What do you do? How do you interpret the results? And again, I'm just giving you a big broad brush here. I could say a lot more about all of this, but I'm hoping we can, in the Q&A, some of the details of all this will come out. So typically where you begin with interpreting results is with, if it's a water result specifically, is you'd look at EPA drinking water standards. I mentioned earlier they're the only enforceable standards, so that's a good standard to start with. And I think there are 87 or something like that that include the primary drinking water standards. EPA also has secondary drinking water standards. There's 15 of those. Those essentially address things like odor, taste, and color, things like that. So they're not at all dealing with toxic chemicals. But the primary drinking water standards, I think there's 53 volatile organic chemicals, 16 metals, a variety of pesticides, radionuclides, and then those that result from the chlorination, or the, what do they call it? Disinfectant, byproducts of the disinfectant process. So there's 7 or 8 of those. And some of these have both drinking water, what they call MCLs, maximum contaminant levels, but they also have maximum contaminant goals. And any chemical that is suspect or known to be a carcinogen has a goal of 0. And EPA then sets a MCL based on practicality. It's not a health-based value. It's just what's reasonable. So usually like levels will go, like benzene went from 0 to 5 or 2. I forget what the current benzene level is in drinking water, but they back off from what should be 0. So any exposure to a carcinogen is considered to be adding to your risk of exposure and unacceptable. The next most commonly used guideline for interpreting any kind of results, soil, air, or water, or what EPA refers to as their regional screening levels. These are risk-based values that they have developed that are available on the EPA website that give you a variety of different, and are broken out in a variety of different ways for residential exposure, air, water, and soil, for industrial, commercial exposure applications, air, water, and soil, and so on. And they have things like groundwater values in terms of risk to drinking water, groundwater values and risk to soil. So they have a whole lot of values that are there that can give you some guidance. But in my experience, you can say, you can do some soil testing and get soil values that exceed these regional screening levels, and nobody reacts to it, no matter what it is. Because when you talk to EPA about it, they simply say, well, those are just meant for a starting point for conversation. And, I've been doing all of this risk analysis work for a long time. And what I realized, and what I think EPA realized, maybe 25 or 30 years ago, that if they have these standards, I mean, they tried to set a standard for dioxin and then completely backed away down and away from it. And the reason is because if they have a standard, then you can take these companies to court and force them to achieve that, whether it's cleanup or whether it's whatever it is, and any kind of cleanup. And EPA doesn't want to do that. They don't want to create standards that EPA will hold, that the corporations will be held accountable to. So they just do these guidance values, which they argue gives them flexibility. And that's just, well, it does that. That's not the real reason, not in my opinion, why they do it. Anyhow, we could talk about that a long time. But there's also some state guidelines. Some state agencies have soil, air, and water values that can be useful to compare your results to. There are also, and for water exposures, surface water in particular, ambient water quality criteria. They have to protect people using the water as well as aquatic life using the water. So those are also very health protective and useful. And similarly, there are a whole range of ecological criteria that protect benthic organisms and plants and wildlife. And so, those are not generally what we look at. We're more concerned about how these things impact people and the communities that we're working with, but they exist. And so they're out there. All right, I just want to briefly touch on some of the uncertainties in interpreting these results, because even when you have the drinking water standards, there's all kinds of questions. And fundamentally, certainly all the risk-based ones, and most of this apply to the risk-based ones, because the drinking water standards are health-based. They're driven by actual data on health, whether it's humans in the case of epidemiological studies or animal studies. The risk numbers are not, because the risk numbers are based primarily, they're driven initially by information on exposure. What do we know about the exposure levels? And the exposure one's on the very bottom of this chart. And it's the whole issue with exposures is how do you know how long any person's been exposed? You know, and the risk calculation and assumptions made on how long that exposure occurred. And you don't know about how the past levels of exposures. You have to assume that the exposure is constant, and it's never constant, no matter what medium you're in. Maybe soil, that's the closest one, but even that changes over time. So, so the only health-based standards are the drinking water standards. Everything else, all of the guidance values that are out there are not. And all of these values rely on toxicity and health data that's based on exposure to a single chemical. That's not how people are exposed. So that's a value, but limited. There's I'd say almost no understanding of low-level mixtures and what the health effects are when you're exposed to mixtures. And again, I think the East Palestine story and situation is really bringing this to the public's attention, because EPA does their analysis based on these, and they get their data and they compare them to their single exposure at a time values. And they say, well, according to what we're seeing, everything's fine. There should be no issues here with the community. And yet the people are continuing almost a year later to have all kinds of symptoms and health problems. There's a clear disconnect between what EPA is saying and what the reality of what's going on in that community. And I believe that the problem there is that there's little understanding about what happens to people exposed to low-level mixtures. And that's true of so many communities, so many of the communities you're from. I'm sure that's the same story. And then we don't have any information on or how to evaluate cumulative exposures. And cumulative exposures means not just over time, what happens to you if you've been living or drinking water that's been contaminated for 5 years, but there are often mixtures in there. There's an additive or a synergistic effect when you're exposed to 2, 3, 5, 10, who knows how many chemicals at the same time. So cumulative has two elements: the number of chemicals you're exposed to and the length of time you're exposed to. And so all of these uncertainties make it nearly impossible for government to say with any kind of certainty what's going on. They can give you an opinion, but somebody who has a different perspective will have a different opinion in all likelihood. I know I've constantly run into that, where I have an opinion that's based primarily on protecting public health. Government or industry, they have a different priority. It's not about protecting public health. It's about whatever their priorities are. So there are also, when you interpret results, there are also sampling factors that can influence the results. And there are 3 questions here that I want to talk about for a little bit. And, one of the things that I hope you take away from today is that fact that if your samples are not collected properly, if their procedures they use are not done in appropriate ways, if they don't sample the right locations, they don't look for the right chemicals, you won't get any data. The results will not be very meaningful. I'm sure you've heard this simple expression, garbage in, garbage out. Well, it very much applies to sampling. If the procedures or if the lab procedures weren't appropriate. Now, let me give you a couple of simple examples. I mentioned the one from East Palestine where EPA looked for VOCs and not vinyl chloride. That's an issue that deals with sampling procedures. But in the case of water testing, if you took a water sample and did not completely fill that water bottle up to the brim, if there's any airspace in that water sample before you seal it up, and you're concerned about volatiles, then any volatile in that water will escape and get into that headspace above the water. So when they open it at the lab, whatever contaminants in there will be gone, unless there's such a high concentration that there's still some there. And there was a quick turnaround time between when it was collected and when it was analyzed at the lab. So sample procedures are critical. Same with analytical procedures. And most of that have to do with these standardized analytical protocols that EPA has developed. We want the labs to be using those. And then there's the limits of detection. Limit detection is extraordinarily important. It's probably one of the most important questions to ask if you're dealing with any kind of testing, whether it's what you're doing and you're going to have a lab do it, or whether it's EPA and what they did, or anybody else, any state agency. Detection limits are the levels at which you can determine if there's any contaminant present in that sample. It's a little bit like a volume on a stereo, on a music, on your phone where you're listening to music. When you have to get to a certain point before you can hear before you can hear the music. It's the same thing with detection limit. You have to have it at a certain point low enough to detect what's there. Anything below that detection will be identified as either not present, depending on how the results are presented to you, or that it's an uncertain value because it was below the detection limit. And so in the EPA's mind, it doesn't count. So detection limits are critical. But to get down to appropriate levels, it costs more money. And a lot of times agencies and certainly companies don't want to do that. So they'll just pick higher detection limits, which still shows that they're doing their due diligence by doing a test. But the testing is not very valuable because the detection limits are too high. And again, EPA has been doing that repeatedly. I've seen it. I can't tell you how many times. So these are the general questions to ask. I'm not going to really, I'll just briefly scan through this. I'm not going to go into this in any detail. We have these broken down in general for soil, for air, for water in the guidebook that Hunter's put in the chat. So let me just skip by that, go to my summary chart. So testing is the key to understanding exposure. Be clear why you want your testing. Have a plan for what you'll do with it. And remember, garbage in, garbage out. All right, let me stop there. Let's open things up to questions. Let me stop sharing my screen here.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for going over that. I just wanted to remind everybody that if you are here right now, you will be getting a recording of this very call later on in the week, along with the resources we've recommended. So if everyone has any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat right now, and I will go through them. And if we run out of chat questions, we can move on to people just asking a direct question. The first one that I think would be really helpful, Stephen, is, hold on. Someone asked, how can someone get a hold of the 128 priority pollutants?
Best way to do that is on the EPA website. Just go to EPA and type into Google US EPA and priority pollutants, and you'll get lots of different places that make that available, but EPA is the source. It's it's in our guidebook too, but I think that our guidebook's a couple of years old, and so it probably doesn't have, well, actually, priority pollutant list hasn't changed in 30 years. So yeah, it's in our guidebook as well.
So IRA said that their water tests go to the polluter, which is Tectonic Plastics, and then get mailed to residents instead of coming directly from the lab. This is part of the distrust. Is this a standard practice?
I've seen it go all kinds of ways. I wouldn't necessarily call it standard, but where the companies want to control the narrative and what you know and how and when you know it and how it's delivered to you. So usually you don't get the raw data. That's what you should ask for in that situation. Ask for the actual analytical results directly from the lab. Because while that might be more difficult for you to interpret, it is the way to understand. That's the best way to understand it, because I didn't talk at all about quality control measures, but there's always quality control procedures run whenever any kind of sample is run. So you want to look for that, because if there's contamination in the sample, then the sample may not be accurate. And depending on who took it, that may make a big difference. So in that situation, ask for the raw data from the lab. In addition, unless they're sending you that, unless you're getting that. And we can help you with that question if you're not certain how to handle that. You can certainly send that to Hunter and he can get it to me, and we can take a look at it and give you some feedback on that.
PK asks about international guidelines. I don't know if we deal with international guidelines at CHEJ.
Well, we do and we don't, in the sense that it comes up and we certainly evaluate them as we go, but we don't include them in a lot of what we do because I don't know, there's just a limit to what we can do. So I think there are some good resources out there. In Europe, they have generally more protective standards. They have adopted the precautionary principle, for example, as code, not just an idea. So there's a lot of good things that come out of Europe, but getting anybody to do something different than they would do, whether it's a European standard or EU standard or even the guidelines from your state agency, depends on your organizing pressure. I mean, because these are not enforceable in any way, then the government will not want to do anything, regardless of your results. So that's where having a plan on what to do with your results matters, because you want to be able to use that, you got to generate public support. So often you have to use your results first to educate people, your neighbors, share the information, and then come up with a plan for how people, once they've learned what you've learned, what you want them to do. So that's important too.
Dalia asks, or Dalia, I hope I said your name right. So their community is having issue with the EPA passing wastewater facility, even though it has been causing severe urban flooding. So they ask, who should I contact for an assessment to our degraded EJ community if the EPA is not going to be responsible?
Well, that's a great question. There's no independent group out there. I mean, that you can turn to do an evaluation. Consultants exist, of course, who can do that kind of evaluation. There are NGOs, groups like CHEJ, but we don't have the resources to be able to go do an investigation. We could evaluate an existing one, as some other groups could do as well. But to actually have the money to do that, that would be hard. I don't know how you would do that.
Next, Evelyn from Kentucky is asking how tests, wait, so uh, we are a very small community and money will be an issue to most people. Is there a way to have affordable testing?
Again, it depends a little bit on what your goals are. I mean, if you're just trying and what you're trying to figure out, that's not easy. I mean, I'd be happy one-on-one to have a conversation with you about that. But fundamentally, what you'd probably do is trying to hone in on a handful of contaminants. And if you want to do it yourself, I mean, you still may be able to go maybe to a university nearby if you have, can identify, let's say you want to look at certain heavy metals or there's certain volatile chemicals you want to look for. You maybe I'll go to a university, a chemistry professor or somebody like that might have access to stuff and they might be willing to help. So that's one option, but there's not ultimately so the idea would be maybe to gather tests and look for a few chemicals, see what you find, and then go from there. But I'd be happy to talk more about that with you one-on-one. Just contact Hunter, and Hunter, you should make sure you put your email or something like that in the chat or somewhere so people can access that.
I'm putting that in the chat right now. Also, someone, I don't know specifically, someone asked earlier how they could test for PFAS in their water.
Well, there's a lot of state agencies now that are getting funded by the federal government to do PFAS testing. Many of them don't know what to do or who to test so I think I would suggest you go to your state agencies and ask them to do a general PFAS test. And a lot of them may be willing to do it. A lot of it, whether they do or not, may depend on politically what's going on. And I mean that politically, not in terms of Democrats and Republicans, but more in terms of, what's the public attention on this situation. There's a lot of attention. They might be less willing to do it just because there'll be ramifications. The more you know, the more you'll want to do about it, or maybe want to hold them accountable to do. But I think I would start, there are a handful of places that are offering to do it. I know there was one NGO that was offering to do it at one point because they got some money, but I don't remember who that was.
Several people, I'm combining several different questions, but there's been a consistent theme of people asking for testing odors. So one example is there was a disgusting mulch apparently being used at a school. Another one is coming from a plastics company. And so it seems like there's a consistent theme of how do you test for odor?
That's a really good question. Because odors could be anything, and so it it I don't know of I don't know of any general odor tests. I'll bet there's one out there, but I'm just not familiar with it that one could use to just determine whether there's a noxious odors. I don't know of any, but I'll bet there's one out there. So I can't be very helpful on that. I'm sorry.
So Deborah also is asking, where and what would you test for at a nuclear reactor site?
I would test for radiation. I mean, just simply put, radiation. Now, there's a that's a general term, and it could be a variety of different radionuclides you could look for. But I think it would depend on whether you think it's in the air or in your water, in the soil, I know in Ohio and other states, they've got radiation going into their trucks that they use it for a de-icer in the trucks that deal with the snow and whatnot. But in a radiation plant, I think it would be in the air in all likelihood. And I don't do a whole lot of work on radiation. I leave that to the radiation folks. But I can certainly put you in touch with some groups that do that kind of work.
Again, I'm going to be coagulating several different questions. Seems to be a consistent question of, if a group has data, how can they interpret it? And I don't know if you want me to offer this, but at CHEJ, we do offer data interpreting, correct, Stephen?
Yes, that is part of what we do. But we do it in conjunction with our organizing work, and so it's not done in isolation. But aside from that piece of that response, usually the best way to try to interpret results is to compare them to some of these guideline values. If it's not drinking water, I would go to the regional screening levels and look up residential and just to get a sense of what your results say. Um, and certainly we can help you with that. So that is something, if you have questions, if you have data that you need help interpreting, you can reach out to Hunter. And we have limited capacity because we have pretty small staff, but we can put people in a queue and try to address those questions. But we'll also want to talk with you more also about organizing and have a sense of what you plan to do with the results. I mean,
Mhm.
one of the ways we decide, or we help make decisions about groups that we work with, because we have such a small staff, is we hope that you have a plan and you can share that with us as to what you want to do with the results. Because we're not a consulting firm where it doesn't matter what you do with the results, and we're just going to get paid to do it, because we don't get paid. I mean, we raise funds to do this work, so we don't charge groups. The only thing we ask is that you join as a group member, which is $100. And some groups can do that and some cannot, but we ask that anyway. But certainly you can reach out to us, and we'll do what we can to try to help you figure that out.
Mhm. And again, I put my email in the chat. I will put it in the chat again, and y'all can just send me a quick summary of exactly what you need help with, and we can get back to you as soon as possible. Also, if anyone wants to go ahead and unmute themselves and ask a direct question, I think we've read a lot of chat questions. If you want to go ahead and just start raising your hand or whatever, I think that would be appreciated. Michelle, go ahead.
Okay, so I have a severely complex problem in my home environment that occurred after my house was weatherized too tightly. It became a negative air pressure box that has some kind of severe indoor air quality problem that consists of like a vapor type of matter that I can, you know, capture on my phone on video, and it, it carries with it particulates that go into my carpeting, my floors, my fabric, my mattresses, like everywhere. It's like the sandy type of stuff. I lived with the stuff for 2 years straight. It's like back being a beach in every single room. I don't know what's happening here, but it's pretty bad and significant, and no one can figure it out. No building scientist, no IQ person. Like, I've had HVAC guys in here all from 2 counties. It's taken 3 years. No one's been able to do it. Please help me. I don't know what to do.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure how we can help you necessarily. We can do a one-on-one and I can better understand what's been done because that's what I would have to understand is what kind of tests have been done. Maybe what would be helpful is if you could put together a one-page summary of what kind of tests you've had done and maybe attach the results or a link to the reports or whatever, something like that. Then
Okay.
we take a look at it. And like I say, I'm not sure we don't have the real capacity to do an investigation like that, but we can at least give you some reaction in terms of what we think.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Deborah, you're next.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I just wanted to know, it's a very, very basic question. How do you define groundwater as opposed to just water?
Okay. Well, fundamentally and simply, it's the water that comes from the surface from rain that percolates through the soil and settles in the ground. And there's usually a shallow groundwater table and a deeper groundwater table. And so that shallow groundwater table can be as little as a foot or two from the surface, or it could be 30 or 40 or 100 feet below the surface. Depends on the soil makeup.
And what
So
about the deep groundwater? How deep is that?
that could be hundreds of feet, a couple, 200, 300 feet. And in terms of, if you were going to do some monitoring, you'd want to, if concerned about groundwater contamination, you'd have to try to identify which table the water contamination is in, which water table. Is it in the upper, the shallow, or the deeper? And initially, you'd start with the shallow, anticipating that's likely where it is. But your monitoring wells have to be sure to be whoever's putting the monitoring wells. I know you wouldn't be, no individual does this, but if monitoring wells were installed, they would have to be installed so that they're in the proper aquifer, the shallow or the deep. Because it's easy to think you're doing, if it gets down, I mean, deep aquifers, depending on in areas where there's rocks and shale and things like that, deep aquifers can be, 50, even less than 100 feet from the surface. So, that's where the contamination is and the monitoring wells are above that, your results will all be negative, and it's just because it's not appropriate. It wasn't done right.
So if there's a leaking pipe and we know where it is, isn't that, and that's where the chemicals are coming from, would you test right at the point where it was leaking?
Yes, I would gather that if you could, I mean, typically that's not easy and might be involved in trespassing going on private property, depending on where it is and who owns it and all that. And I wouldn't advise that, but if you could, that would be the ideal. And that would be not a groundwater sample, but a surface water sample, because you'd be taking it from the pipe. So it's a discharge sample, actually. It would be more appropriate description for it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Marcy, you're up.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. We're very interested, Dennis and I, because we are co-chairs for Clean Air for All Now, which involves Intel, the semiconductor facility that is planted in the middle of several cities and villages. We have some neighbors that literally are like on the fence line of Intel. And what I found curious and interesting about your presentation was blood testing, because we do have some people that are extremely close to the fence line that would be perfect candidates for the VOC testing, some of the other acronyms that were mentioned. And I think they would be willing to get the test done. And we may even be able to, with the help of donations, pay for some of those. My question is, who draws the blood? You say we can do it ourselves, but obviously we're not going to be doing that. And so if we did find some participants who were willing to, go through the process and have their blood tested, because they are so very close to the fence line and have experienced many, many medical issues, how would we go about proceeding with blood tests only for those people who are closest to the fence line?
Right. Well, the same question applies to that applies to environmental testing in that sense, in the sense of is why do you want to do this? What's your plan and for what you're going to do with the results? Any nurse could take a blood sample, but before you would do that, I would suggest you find who's going to do the analysis. There are certain labs that'll do blood work. So you'd want to talk to them first, find out how the sample, I mean, again, the same nurse could do the sample, but it's important to maintain the integrity of the sample from the time it's taken to the time it goes to the lab. So whether it's putting on ice or whatever it is, you'd want to talk to the lab about any specific procedures that they want to make sure are done so that you maintain the integrity of the sample. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Marcy. Your turn, Evelyn. Evelyn? Okay, Elizabeth, let's go to you.
Hi, thank you, Stephen. It's been real informative. I wanted to ask if you had reviewed or looked at the quick environmental exposure and sensitivity inventory as being useful in identifying chemical injury. I understand it's been used in 14 different countries now and over 100 peer-reviewed publications on it. And it's been published by NIH, and the EPA is not using it, but it apparently can identify chemical injury below what the dose response mechanism usually indicates.
Right,
Do
right.
you think that, I mean, it's a free online test. Do you think that's something that communities that are facing these challenges could at least use to draw attention to their injuries?
I'm familiar with it. I haven't done a lot of research into it. But what I can't figure out is if a group or an individual were to do it, what they would do with the information. You know, it goes back to this question of what's the plan? What are you going to do? How do you use it? How does it help you get where you want to go? Just doing it, I don't think, you know, because government's so reluctant, I think it's not mainstream, so to speak. So government isn't accepting it. So they don't know what to do with it. So the first thing they'll do is nothing. So I that's my concern about it. Not that people shouldn't maybe do it. I don't know enough to suggest they should, but I don't know. That's the question. That's the thing I don't know.
You don't think they could just use it in each individual group to accumulate the information and use it as a presentation device?
Well, they could, but towards what end? Is that, you know, like how would that change anything necessarily? I mean,
Well,
again, if they're organized and they have a plan and they have an ask, all of those things are in place, then yes, that could be helpful. It's another tool. It could
well,
turn
it
into a
is
tool.
free and it's online and it's available. And I mean, it wouldn't cost a lot for testing.
Mhm. Yeah, that's true.
And
I'll look into it more. I will do that.
thank you. I think I've left a tutorial on there that might help explain it.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Sure.
Evelyn, are you back?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I am a part of the people that was evacuated due to the CSX derailment in Livingston, Kentucky. And that happened on Thanksgiving, but they've not wanted to test our soil and our water up until now. And the only ones wanting to test it is the lawyers. Should we trust their results?
These are lawyers representing who?
It's Morgan and Morgan supposed to be representing the people, but they've been our lawyers ever since they was hired on by one of the neighbors a week after it happened, and they're just now testing the soil.
Mhm. Well,
Why would they wait so long?
yeah, I don't think it's a yes or no answer because I think it would depend on, you know, who they hire to do that testing and how they do it. So I think there's potential that it could be useful if they're willing to share it. but I don't know that they would share it with anybody other than, the client. So I don't know, again, how helpful that would be. I guess that would be the question I would ask. Would they share all the results with the public, even without identifiers, so that you wouldn't, remove the name of the person whose house it is or the address? Would they, but that's what I would ask them. But it could be helpful, but I just don't think they would share information other than to the client, to their clients.
So should we try to get tested ourselves?
Why don't you and I talk one-on-one? I think this is a more in-depth conversation, and we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I don't,
That'd be fun.
yeah, I don't want to give you an off-the-cuff answer that might not be very helpful.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. We only have time for one more question, so I'm going to go to Teresa. And anyone who else has a question, please email me directly at hmarion@chej.org, and we can go over your question more specifically, probably in a one-on-one. So go ahead, Teresa.
Thank you. Teresa Lander from Detroit, Michigan. My question is brief. You mentioned trusted labs. How, as a small community organization, do we find trusted labs? Is there a manual or listing for trusted labs? Because we did set out testing to a lab in California many years ago on air quality. Our samples came back with pollution off the chart, right? But when we turned information over to then the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, which is now Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, they refuted, as you mentioned, our information. However, they took our data. When they took our data and of the sampling, then they came back and wanted to have a conversation with us. Now we're dealing with PFAS. How do we find trusted labs to send soil samples to them to test them for PFAS? Thank you.
Okay. Well, that's a hard question to answer, but the first thing I would look for is a lab that has EPA certification. The second thing I would look for, in all likelihood, is a lab that is not in the state of Michigan. Because usually the in-house labs work for the state agency, is one of their biggest clients. And therefore, in a situation like what you're describing, there are probably going to be conflicts. And so I think I would try to find an out-of-state lab that has an EPA certification. And any of those labs that do that, you can trust their results. And EPA would have no choice but to accept them because they're certified by EPA. The state would have to accept it as well. But it'll cost a little more money to do that. So that's the only downside to going to that. But it addresses the credibility question. And I think you can trust the results if and I've worked with a number of labs around the country that in collaboration with local groups, and I have found most of these reasonably small labs that work regionally are very helpful and very trustworthy. And that's true. I'm sure that's a generalization based on a limited experience, but it's still, I think, out there.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for attending this training call. Just to recap, everyone's going to receive a recording of this training call. They're going to receive the environmental testing CHEJ guidebook. And then I'm going to also put my contact information. So if you have any more questions, you can just go ahead and contact me directly, and expect that email probably within the next 2 to 3 days. So thank you, Stephen, for hosting this, and thank you everybody for attending.
Thank you all.